January 7th, 1943. Northern France, occupied territory. The cold, biting wind swept across the muddy countryside, cutting through layers of worn fabric. Edith D., a nurse in her late 20s, stood at the edge of a weathered barn, looking out over the barren fields. Her heart pounded, a constant, urgent rhythm that mirrored the sound of distant artillery fire. She had been waiting for hours, each minute stretching into eternity, as she scanned the horizon for any sign of movement. The sound of boots crunching on the frozen earth suddenly broke her concentration. She stiffened, instinctively glancing over her shoulder to make sure she had her coat pulled tightly around her, hiding the small bundle of medical supplies hidden beneath it. The young woman had been tasked with one of the most dangerous missions of her life. There was no glory, no parade waiting for her if she succeeded. There was only the chance to save lives, and the almost certain risk of death if she failed. Edith wasn't just carrying bandages and syringes. She wasn't just transporting antibiotics and sterile dressings to a desperate underground network of resistance fighters who had been holding their ground in the shadows of occupied France. She was carrying the very hope of a nation still suffocating beneath Nazi boots. She was the lifeline between the men and women fighting for their freedom and the ones they could not reach without her. As a nurse, Edith had seen the worst of humanity, but she had also witnessed the resilience of those who refused to bend under pressure, who dug their heels in and stood defiant even when the enemy was right at their door. It was this spirit that she clung to now, as she took a deep breath and steadied herself, ready for the journey ahead. She had done this before, smuggling supplies into occupied villages, working in the shadows, evading the prying eyes of Nazi soldiers. But today it was different. Today, the stakes were higher. Today, she was carrying vital information, encoded letters that could tip the balance in a war that seemed, at times, unwinnable. The German forces had tightened their grip on the region, making it nearly impossible for anyone to travel without attracting attention. Roadblocks and checkpoints dotted the countryside, and the streets of towns and villages were filled with soldiers, their eyes scanning for any signs of resistance. Edith knew how to stay invisible, how to blend into the background, to appear like nothing more than another woman lost in the fog of war. But the price of invisibility was constant fear. Fear of being caught, fear of failing, fear of death. As she adjusted the strap on her bag and prepared to move, a rustling sound behind her made her freeze. For a moment, she thought she had been spotted, that the noise was the sound of boots approaching, soldiers coming to question her. But the shape that appeared from behind the barn wasn't wearing a German uniform. It was a figure wrapped in a dark coat, a man with a thin, gaunt face. His movements were swift but controlled, a shadow against the landscape. His eyes locked onto Edith's, and for a split second, she considered running. But something in his gaze stopped her. There was no hostility there, only a quiet, knowing look. "You're late," Edith whispered, her voice low, betraying none of the tension she felt inside. The man, Henri, nodded curtly, his expression unreadable. He was one of the few who knew of her mission. A former soldier turned resistance fighter, Henri had been working on the network of safe houses across the region for months. He was the one who had given her the letters to smuggle, the ones that could change everything. They were the key to unlocking the next phase of the Resistance's plans. If she could get them to the right people, everything would shift. But getting them, there was no simple task. "Everything is set," Henri replied, glancing over his shoulder as if expecting to see someone following him. He seemed agitated, his usual calm demeanor slipping slightly. "But you need to move quickly. The Germans are tightening their grip on the area. There's word they'll be checking every vehicle and train heading south in the next few hours." Edith felt her stomach churn at the news. Her heart began to race, but she kept her expression steady. Henri wasn't someone who exaggerated. If he said things were getting worse, then they were. "Where'd I need to go?" she asked, her voice still a whisper. Henri looked around nervously before stepping closer. "There's a crossing near the old railway station, past the woods. It's risky, but it's the only way through the blockade. Once you're past that, You'll have to make your way to the safe house in the hills. You know the route." She nodded. Edith had made this journey countless times before, each time more dangerous than the last. She knew the paths, the forests, the fields, everything about the landscape had been burned into her memory. But that didn't mean she was immune to the dangers lurking around every corner. The thought of crossing German-held checkpoints sent a cold shiver through her. But there was no choice. "Be careful," Henri added, his voice more urgent now. "They're becoming more suspicious of people traveling alone. Don't trust anyone, not even the locals." "Of course," Edith replied, though she knew better than to trust too much in her own instincts. They had failed her before, had cost her more than one friend. But she had never failed to carry out mission. Not once. With a final nod, Henri disappeared back into the shadows, leaving Edith standing alone once more. Her breath came in short, rapid bursts as she turned toward the woods, where the path to the railway station lay ahead. She didn't look back. There was no time for hesitation, no time for doubt. Each step carried her closer to danger, closer to the unknown. She had no idea how many soldiers would be watching the crossing, or how many more checkpoints awaited her on the way. All she had was her wits, her determination, and the certainty that the lives of those she sought to help depended on her success. The hours seemed to stretch as Edith navigated the dense forest that lined the railway station. The trees stood like silent sentinels, their branches bare against the harsh winter sky. The only sound was the crunch of snow beneath her boots, the occasional rustle of a distant bird, and the rhythmic pounding of her heartbeat in her chest. When she reached the station, it was eerily quiet. The train tracks, once busy with the movement of freight and passengers, were now abandoned, overgrown with weeds. A few derelict cars sat on the tracks, their rusted bodies a stark reminder of the war's toll on the infrastructure. But it was the soldier standing at the edge of the platform who caught her attention. He was young, his uniform ill-fitting, a cigarette dangling from his lips. He didn't look like a soldier who had been hardened by the war. His eyes were tired, empty. Edith hesitated for a moment, assessing him. She was close enough now to see the dark circles beneath his eyes, to sense the tension in his posture. He didn't seem to be actively guarding the station, but she knew that could change at any moment. With a deep breath, she moved forward, slowly, deliberately. Her fingers brushed against the small bundle of supplies hidden beneath her coat. Her hands were shaking now, despite her best efforts to remain calm. She could feel the weight of the letters pressing against her side, the knowledge of what they meant, the chance to strike a blow against the Nazi war machine. As she passed the soldier, she avoided eye contact, keeping her gaze focused ahead. The silence between them was thick, charged with an unspoken understanding. She could feel him watching her, his gaze following her every step. Her throat tightened, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. Edith froze. The world seemed to stop around her. Her breath caught in her throat as she turned to face him. The soldier stood there, his hand resting on the rifle slung over his shoulder. There was a long pause, as if he was waiting for her to say something. But what could she say? Her mind raced, searching for a way out. She had no choice but to trust in the smallest of chances. The letters. Her life for them. The weight of everything hung in the balance. Chapter 2 KO expand Caro 1,300+ words, Ma English Ma, without any headings and numbers February 21st, 1943. A small French village near the Pyrenees. The air was thick with fog, a persistent mist that clung to the earth like a blanket, muffling sounds and distorting shapes. Edith D. moved through the narrow, cobblestone streets, her steps deliberate but quiet, each footfall calculated to avoid drawing attention. The village, once vibrant and full of life, had become a ghost of itself, haunted by the presence of Nazi soldiers who now patrolled the streets with cold, indifferent eyes. The shutters of homes were bolted shut, and the few brave souls who dared venture out kept their heads low, their faces hidden beneath hoods and scarves. The war had swallowed this place whole, and its people had learned to live with the silence that came with occupation. But Edith wasn't here for the silence. She wasn't here for the fog or the empty streets. She was here on a mission, one that could alter the course of history if it succeeded. Henri had given her new instructions. This time, she was to meet someone in the village, a contact who could help her get the supplies to a safe house further down the mountain. It was a delicate operation, one fraught with danger. The risk of being discovered was ever present, and Edith's every instinct screamed at her to turn back, to find another route, to run before the enemy could close in. But there was no turning back. Not now. Not when lives hung in the balance. She paused at the corner of a building, her breath clouding in the cold air. Across the street, in the shadow of a dilapidated bakery, a figure appeared. He was tall, with a long coat that fluttered in the wind, and he moved with a quiet purpose, as though he belonged in the fog, as though he were part of it. Edith's pulse quickened. She knew it was him, the man she had been waiting for. He wasn't like the others in the village. His movements were too fluid, too practiced. He had the air of someone who knew how to survive, how to blend in when necessary, how to disappear when the world was watching. She stepped out from behind the corner and made her way toward him, her eyes flicking from side to side, always scanning, always alert. Her hand tightened around the small leather bag she carried, the bag that contained the life-saving medical supplies and the encoded messages that could change everything. She didn't know much about the man she was about to meet. Henri had given her only the most basic details, but she trusted him, at least for now. There was no one else. When she reached him, he didn't speak immediately. Instead, he nodded once, a brief, almost imperceptible gesture. His face was angular, his features sharp, but there was something in his eyes, a weariness, perhaps, or the weight of something deeper, that made her feel uneasy. He seemed to be waiting for something, as if deciding whether to trust her. Edith felt the same hesitation in her chest, but she didn't have the luxury of time. There was too much at stake. The man nodded again, but this time he looked around them, his eyes scanning the surrounding buildings with a practiced, military precision. "You're alone." "Yes," Edith replied, her voice steady despite the knot in her stomach. "I have the supplies. I was told to meet you here." "Good," the man said, his voice low and gravelly. "We don't have much time. We'll go through the back alleys. The main streets aren't safe today. There's a patrol." Edith nodded, her heart racing as she followed him through the maze of narrow, winding lanes. The village seemed to close in around them, the fog swallowing them whole as they moved through the shadows. She could hear the distant murmur of voices, the faint echo of boots on cobblestones, and the ever-present hum of the war that had infected every corner of Europe. But here, in the heart of occupied France, it felt as though the war was suffocating, slowly strangling the life out of the people who had once lived here. As they walked, Edith tried to learn more about her mysterious contact, but he remained silent, his face shadowed by his coat and the heavy fog. She wanted to ask him about the resistance, about the efforts to liberate France from the grip of the Nazi regime, but she knew better than to press him. Trust had to be earned, and trust in wartime was a fragile thing. She had seen it broken before, too many times. After what seemed like hours of winding through alleyways and side streets, the man finally stopped. He turned to Edith and motioned for her to follow him into a narrow, forgotten doorway. The building was old, its wooden door cracked and weathered by years of neglect. But inside, it was warm, and the smell of something cooking wafted through the air. Edith's eyes adjusted to the dim light as she stepped inside, her senses on high alert. She could hear muffled voices in the next room, the sound of a few people speaking quietly. There was a flicker of movement, but she couldn't see their faces. "This way," the man said, gesturing for her to follow him down a long, narrow corridor. The walls were lined with old, faded photographs of a time before the war. They were pictures of families, of children playing in the streets, of a life that had been lost in the storm of occupation. Edith's hand tightened around the leather bag as she walked, her mind racing with questions she didn't have the answers to. At the end of the corridor, the man opened a door and motioned for her to enter. Inside, a small, dimly lit room awaited her. A table sat in the center, its surface covered with maps, documents, and various other supplies. A woman sat at the table, her back turned as she pored over a piece of paper. She was older than Edith, but there was a sharpness to her, a presence that made her seem younger than she was. When she turned to face them, Edith saw the same weariness in her eyes that she had seen in Henry's, a quiet exhaustion born of years spent in the shadows, fighting for something that seemed more and more like an impossible dream. "You have the supplies?" the woman asked, her voice soft but firm. There was no question in her tone, only a sense of urgency. Edith nodded and reached into her bag, pulling out the carefully packed medical supplies. "Everything you need is here," she said, placing the items on the table. The woman's eyes scanned the contents with quick precision, nodding once when she saw what was inside. "This will do," the woman said, her gaze shifting to the encoded letters that Edith had smuggled in. "And the messages?" "They're here," Edith replied, her voice steady despite the tightness in her chest. She had done what was asked of her. Now, the rest was out of her hands. She had no way of knowing what would happen to the messages or the lives they would touch, but she trusted these people, trusted Henri, trusted this woman. The woman took the letters carefully, almost reverently, before tucking them into a small compartment hidden beneath the table. "You've done well," she said quietly. "But your work here is not done. There's more to come. We'll need you again." Edith felt a surge of pride, mixed with an undercurrent of fear. "I'm ready," she said, even though part of her wondered if she ever truly could be. As she prepared to leave, the man who had escorted her here stepped forward, his expression unreadable. "Be careful on your way back," he said. "The patrols are getting more aggressive. You can't afford to be seen." Edith nodded, her hand reaching for the door handle. She had made it this far, but the real test lay ahead. The journey back would be even more perilous than the one she had just completed. She stepped back into the fog, her senses heightened, her mind racing. There was no time to linger, no time to question what might happen next. All she had was the certainty that the work she was doing mattered. Even if the world never knew her name, she would carry on, quietly, in the shadows, doing what she could to change the course of history. May 5th, 1944. The outskirts of a liberated town in France. The streets were flooded with the sounds of celebration. The distant rumble of artillery, now replaced by the crackle of radio broadcasts, the laughter of young soldiers, and the clatter of boots on the cobblestones. France was beginning to breathe again, cautiously at first, as though testing the air after years of suffocating under occupation. There was a sense of something profound in the air, something that could only be understood by those who had lived through the darkness. Edith D., however, walked through it all with a quiet restraint, the sounds of victory echoing faintly in her mind as she kept her head down and her eyes focused on the narrow street ahead. She had not come here to celebrate. She had not come for the joy, the cheers, the sense of triumph that now filled the air. She had come because her work, her endless hours of risk, her countless missions through enemy lines, had culminated in a moment that would be buried, lost in the grand narrative of history. Edith had been part of something much larger than herself, something that could change the course of a war. But now, as the streets swelled with the exuberant relief of liberation, she felt her presence fading into the background, a shadow slipping through the cracks of a world that was now too busy celebrating to remember the small, quiet moments that had brought them to this point.